Everything beautiful in this life is either immoral, illegal, or leads to obesity. This quote from Oscar Wilde could have just as easily been heard in some random bar on a Friday night, and it would have been just as appropriate. But there is rarely ever much literary engagement going on at such establishments. Whether it be a cocktail with your girlfriends, a couple of glasses with some compatriots at the bar, or some drinks at home, it all ends up the same. Even if you yourself do not drink alcohol, you've probably still seen how it affects the body. Drunk people start to, well, overeat. And these moments we rarely see them reaching for something like celery. And there you go. Before long you're looking at obesity, just like Wilde was talking about. So why does alcohol give you the crazy munchies, and is it possible to satiate these cravings with something other than burgers and pizza? Scientists have found the answers to both questions, and they're actually a bit off-putting. And if we are being completely honest, it's worth noting that, according to statistics, the most common chronic diseases in the United States are obesity and alcoholism. Okay, but why the horror stories when it's just a couple of drinks on the weekend and half a pizza? Okay, maybe 3 or 4 servings of alcohol and 2 more burgers. All this just because a person isn't able to properly control their drunken hunger, nor even resist this urge, really. The good news is that a minimal amount of alcohol may not really kickstart the process of nighttime eating. The word minimal just means a single glass of wine or a cocktail, a mug of beer, or a shot of something stronger. But it still depends on the brain's reaction, not just the number of ounces or milliliters consumed. The bad news is that resisting the urge to eat after drinking is almost impossible. This hunger originates in the brain. Generally speaking, terrible things happen to it at such moments, since alcohol affects the body like a poison or a drug. Actually, this effect is brought about by ethyl alcohol. This chemical compound is defined as a depressant or a psychoactive substance that depresses the central nervous system. Make note that I said depressant without the prefix anti. Ethanol enters the bloodstream and before long reaches the brain. It kills neurons and disrupts the work of the hippocampus region. Here lies the key to the strange behavior called drunkenness. The fact is that the hippocampus is a kind of sage among other parts of the brain. It's responsible for learning and memory, orientation in space, regulation of emotions, and control of impulsive reactions. Its task is to locate the solutions to things with the help of logic and reasoning. In other words, almost everything that makes us conscious people depend on the hippocampus. Alcohol prevents the hippocampus from functioning properly. And then there are memory lapses, uneven gait, out-of-control emotions, impulsive decisions, and very strange logic. Ethyl alcohol incapacitates the so-called sage, leaving our primitive part in charge. So there's that bit. But the temporary insanity on the part of the hippocampus still doesn't explain the sudden feeling of hunger, especially when you consider that alcoholic drinks contain a large portion of calories. The bigger the glass, the more of these you're going to be looking at. 3.5 ounces, 100 grams, of dry wine contains about 70 to 80 calories. That's not too much. But sweetened or homemade drinks can already hit anywhere from 170 to even 250 calories. There are only 30 to 60 of them in a 3.5 ounces, 100 grams, of beer and 235 in the same amount of vodka. But here's the catch. Nobody ever drinks only 3.5 ounces or 100 grams of beer. People rarely ever limit themselves to just one can. The same thing often happens with wine, too. Strong drinks are consumed in smaller volumes or in cocktails, but these are no longer just empty alcohol calories, but also a lot of sugar. And let's not forget the appetizer either. For beer, we're looking at pizza, chips, or something else deep-fried, fatter, and overall more calorie-dense. Dessert can be had with the second glass of wine at dinner. As far as cocktails or whiskey goes, it's not really that important. Theoretically, a person should feel full after all that, at least enough to no longer feel hungry. But the exact opposite is what happens instead. So after eating a full and healthy dinner with a glass of wine, you then proceed to destroy half the supplies in your refrigerator or order a pizza. After drinking alcohol, you always want some sort of delicious, fatty, carbohydrate-packed, high-calorie food. And the reason again sits with how ethanol affects the brain. Scientists conducted an experiment on mice, which led to an amazing discovery. During alcoholic intoxication of the body, certain neurons are activated in the front of the brain. It turned out that these are the same cells that are responsible for the feeling of hunger. They send a false signal to the brain, telling it that you need to refuel. That's why you want to eat after having alcoholic drinks. Your brain only thinks you're hungry. This is where the resupply order is coming from. And despite the fact that we are intelligent creatures, it's almost impossible to resist this. After all, the brain's primary task is to ensure the proper functioning of the body, and without energy, this is impossible. But the main thing here that scientists discovered in the course of the aforementioned experiment isn't even that. They also studied the relationship between alcohol consumption and fatty, high-calorie foods. Things don't look too bright over here either. What did the scientists do? They took 3 groups of mice, young male mice to be exact. This probably has some importance from a scientific perspective. In the first group, the mice ate exclusively fatty foods, whenever they wanted, however much they wanted. Additionally, for 4 days a week, 4 hours per day, they were served alcohol diluted in water. They still had access to clean water the whole time too. The second group received regular mouse food and drink under the same conditions. And the third group of mice had limited access to both the alcohol mixture and fatty foods, but the rest of the time they were given normal foods. The experiment lasted 8 weeks overall. During this time, everything remained unchanged, except for one key detail. The researchers gradually increased the strength of the alcohol mixture. At the beginning of the experiment, it was 10%, but by the end, it was twice as strong. What is the result? The mice in one of the groups went completely ham. They consistently overate and drank more than the others, and we are obviously not talking about the water. After such a feast, these mice gained noticeable weight. Surprisingly, this happened to the third group as well. It would seem that the situation ought to have been the worst off for the first, since they were on a fat diet. But in the third group, the mice had the greatest variety, both normal and high-calorie food, pure water, and alcohol. So what's the issue here? First off, all the same neurons are to blame. The same circuit in the brain is responsible for the excessive eating of fatty and unhealthy sweets, as well as overdoing it with alcohol. And secondly, the experiment has indicated that limiting access to foods high in fat leads to overeating. And since there's only one circuit in this case, the brain decides to compensate for the lack of fatty foods with more alcohol. It turns out this is all a vicious circle. The more strictly you restrict yourself from fast food and adult beverages, the more likely you are to pounce on them at the first opportunity. Constant food restrictions often cause compulsive overeating. Again, this activates the same part of the brain associated with drinking. But things can still get even worse. The University of Michigan has made some indications in this regard. Back in 2008, its staff conducted a study that was rather unique at the time. It appeared that giving up junk food could be almost as difficult as giving up drugs. Scientists began to look for signs of addiction to heavily processed junk food, meaning everything that is deep fried, if not other things as well. But they didn't just pay attention to the desire to eat such food, but also to the refusal of it. One of the main signs of addiction is withdrawal syndrome. To put it simply, the point at which there is a breakdown. When a person refuses addictive substances, they become ill, both physically and psychologically. At one point, researchers conducted a survey among people who abstain from junk food. It turned out that in the early days of such avoidance, they had experienced withdrawal symptoms. The survey participants reported an unreasonable kind of sadness, fatigue, and overall irritability, which are all signs of withdrawal. The University of California further confirmed the concerns regarding addiction to junk food. The bad news is that all heavily processed foods that are high in salt, fat, caffeine, and sugar fall into this category. These particular 4 are what makes them addictive. And once again, the brain is at fault here. This time, the happiness hormone dopamine is in full swing. It's released when caffeine, saturated fat, or sugar is ingested. The so-called pleasure center is then stimulated in the brain. And come on, who doesn't like feeling good? That's just the main role of dopamine after all. It's a reward system of sorts. Thus, it is released during light physical activity, solving everyday problems, and any other useful activity. The brain acts like a judge in a competition. If you win, you get a reward. Now imagine that the judge awards you, but all you're doing is just sitting in the stands, drinking Coca-Cola. This is the situation in which the brain finds itself after the release of dopamine due to the ingestion of sugar, fat, or caffeine. It begins to look for the reason why it received said reward and finds nothing else except that you ate junk food. So what do you think it'll choose next time? going on a run, or eating sweets? And there's yet another trap here. Dopamine deficiency feels just like hunger. Even though there is no actual need to fuel the body in this case, it still pushes the person to compulsive overeating. Your brain is trying to get pleasure the easy way again, so it sends you the "I want to eat something sweet" signal. Do you know what else causes this unreasonable release of dopamine? Alcohol, of course. It turns out that the junk food and alcohol pair is practically inseparable. But the situation turns out to be even worse than that. In another study, scientists have discovered the aperitif effect. It turned out that after drinking a drink with about 0.7 ounces, 20 grams of alcohol, people ate a food serving 11% larger than usual, and the high-fat foods on the plate grew to 24% more. So what can be done about all this? Scientists have found only one answer yet. Don't drink so much alcohol that the brain gets drunk, because otherwise you won't be able to resist its unconscious signals. If 0.7 ounces, 20 grams of alcohol in a drink is enough to cause an increased appetite, then an even smaller dose is needed. This might be about a pint, half a liter of beer or cider, less than 7 ounces, 200 milliliters of wine, or 2 ounces, 60 milliliters of a stronger alcohol. But even this might not be a foolproof plan. The best option is longer-term goals like losing weight or maintaining your overall health. If you know that tomorrow morning you'll be going to the gym or going for a run, then the chances of you falling into the over-drinking or overeating trap are less. How do you handle alcohol and fatty foods? Share your thoughts in the comments below.